Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be joined with Christian Science educator Melanie Wahlberg. She's going to be sharing with us discussions about God as spirit, love, and mind rather than as a man-life figure making those arbitrary decisions. We'll also learn how this divine mind is an active presence of good in our lives, as well as learning how God's thoughts remind us of how our spiritual identity guides us to express more life and show us our divine intelligence. This was something that started with her back at a time when she was a college mathematics professor and found when students were coming to her for help with their calculus, conversations frequently turned to spirituality after solving the math problems. So when she shifted her career from mathematics professor to Christian Science practitioner, she became a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship and travels frequently from her home. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Melanie Wahlberg. Melanie, thank you for being on the program today.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Pleasure.
Now, the title of our discussion, I guess, that says we're never alone, what does that mean exactly, that we're never alone?
Well, I've been learning really that what makes us feel alone or even lonely doesn't have to do as much with the people around us as how we feel about our life and our sense of purpose. And I try and bring this out in my lecture. I've discovered that, if I feel stuck with a problem I can't solve or an overwhelming workload, or even if I feel underutilized, any of those can make me feel kind of alone. I mean, even if other people are around trying to help. But I've found that when we get some new inspiration about how things could work out or go forward in a new way, I mean, that's such a relief. We feel great, and then there's no room for loneliness there. And the source of this inspiration is always with us, and my lecture talks about how to get this kind of inspiration more consistently.
I know you're absolutely right on the money. I know when we have problems where we feel like we're trying to solve them, especially if they seem like they're overwhelming, and you're reaching out to people, sometimes I feel like maybe we're looking for some compassion or sympathy. We don't really know which one it is, but we just know that we want to feel soothed. We want to feel better. So I totally understand what you mean by that feeling of feeling alone.
Sure, right.
Now, how would you define a spiritual idea and how it works?
I think of a spiritual idea as an inspiration that comes to us from God. And you talked about God a little bit already in the intro. And when I use the word God, again, I'm thinking, for example, divine mind, this limitless source of ideas and inspirations. And we all get these ideas, I mean, big or little, all day long. Usually we're not even aware of it. It just kind of guides our day. But those ideas are different in quality from the kind of thinking that I would say kind of interrupts our inspiration, the kind of thinking that's really just reactions to the scene around us. Like when you think, oh my gosh, that guy drives like a maniac or something like that. Those reactions don't really get us anywhere. And I'm finding they're not even really innate to our natural way of thinking, which flows entirely from God or from divine mind. But we know the difference when we get some of this spiritual inspiration. God's ideas do something. They improve our lives in a way that the brain just can't. And I'm finding, and I love this idea, that God's ideas are actually on a mission to bless us, to show us more of what we can do, give us a bigger perspective. They're on a mission to heal.
So, Melanie, if you could, describe for us perhaps an incident in your life where this happened for you in a way that the listeners can get a better feel for what you're talking about here.
Sure. And again, there can be little examples of this. I mean, I think sometimes even just being inspired about, I don't know, I think when I was a new mom and I'd get an inspiration about what to make for dinner that night, and then the whole night would go more smoothly after that. They can be on a little scale like that as well. But I think maybe on a bigger scale, let me give an example of, a time that I was in graduate school and I had discovered very unexpectedly, I had been working on my dissertation for months and was very close to completing it, and I was at a meeting and I discovered that I had neglected to document a certain aspect of my research, and so it looked like my previous 8 months of work was all for naught. This was pretty devastating for me to realize, particularly because I was a newlywed. My husband and I had each set up jobs based on my plans to graduate on time. And our jobs were in a new state, several states away. Our whole reason for moving there was because of my job. And if I didn't graduate on time, there were lots of people right behind me very well qualified to take that job. So I had this kind of house of cards that looked dreadful at this point. Sitting there in that meeting, all I could feel was shame, I think, and self-condemnation and embarrassment, and I felt badly. But I realized that type of thinking was not helping me. That type of thinking was kind of like the reactions that I was talking about earlier that doesn't really move us very far. It kind of moves us in circles, frankly. And I thought the one thing I can do while I'm sitting here waiting for this meeting to end so I can call somebody and, make something happen here that's going to have any good impact is to pray. I mean, I can open thought to a new source of ideas. I can listen to divine mind. I can listen to God, to love. And once I made that decision, everything just fell into place. I started getting this wonderful stream of ideas from God about things like my God-given dignity. I mean, I didn't have to freak out in this meeting, my God-given ability. I'd worked hard the last 8 months. I mean, there should have been something salvageable in there. And once those ideas changed my outlook, I got a really practical insight as to how my dissertation could go forward just in a slightly different way, based on ideas that I had kept track of, data that I had kept track of, and that enabled a quick resolution for everybody. And I mean, I was just thrilled, as you can imagine. Everything went smoothly from there forward, and I never even had to tell my husband. It all worked out great. And it was that when I turned a corner and turned to a new source, the ideas were there. The inspiration was right there.
And do you feel at any point at that time that you really literally surrendered? You just said, here, I've done what I know I can possibly do here, but I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. What do you say?
Surrender is a great word. Yeah, I absolutely feel like that. In my talk, I speak about 3 bits of counsel from Christ Jesus about how to consistently get these ideas, and one of them is humility, which I think is similar to surrender. Could I talk about that a little bit?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Well, Christ Jesus said, and many of your listeners will be familiar with this verse probably, but he said, "My judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father that sent me." And I've given this lecture a few times, but that phrase, "I seek not mine own will," oh my goodness, really touches my heart every time. And anytime I hear that, I think, am I doing that? I mean, frankly, Daniel, I wonder if I've ever not sought my own will. I think I often go into things thinking about what I want to happen in that. And the idea of, I'm going to use your word again, surrendering our desire, our plan to God has a way of just opening up everything. And it doesn't usually require our losing anything good.
I agree with you, too, because it's funny how I've done a lot of talks here on the program, especially when it comes to business and goal setting. And you get to a point when you have pursued, let's say, for instance, with us in this radio program over the last 17 years, that you find this sort of innate wisdom working through you that says goals are important because they give you a direction. Your expectation is going to be the thing that will derail you. And what I mean by that is this, that as you're pursuing this goal, whatever it may be, and it's different for everybody, a lot of times we have a vision or a look of what we think it should turn out as, what it should be bringing or giving us. And as a result, I think, we tend to get in our own way with that vision. And we're not saying this is bad or good. It just is what it is. And you'll start missing what's really happening in front of you. But as soon as you pull back that curtain and you realize that journey, we always hear it's the journey that's the most important, value that we gain from the goal. The goal just gives us a direction so we can, embark on that journey, and that's where the reward is. And it becomes pretty amazing that you realize you're getting more than you could have ever imagined. See, your imagination was pretty limited when you have that expectation. But when you let go and you say, okay, my goal, I'm going in this direction. For instance, for me, it was in broadcasting. And I remember in the very beginning, I spent the first couple of years where I was volunteering at the PBS network in Oregon. And I would have people ask me, well, that sounds pretty cool. How much do they pay you? Well, I wasn't getting paid anything, so you kind of duck your chin into your chest, and you're kind of feeling like, oh, yeah, well, I'm not getting paid anything. But after about 2 years of this, I realized, wait a minute, I'm sitting across the table from people I never would have thought I would ever meet in my lifetime, and I'm gaining experiences and getting feedback that really literally tells me this is what I should be doing. Now, the funniest story about that I'll never forget, I was into it my first, say, 3 or 4 months. And it was just a nice, beautiful, sunny day, and there I was. My mind was kind of lost. I'm listening to M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled and Beyond. And sure enough, I kind of got zapped out of my little zone that I was in as I was driving down the street. And this is true. There was a car in front of me whose license plate literally said, broken down, of course, into texting as we see it today, God bless you. And I was like, what are the odds of that? So, like you said, it comes in the small but very big ways a lot of times. And it's just a matter of learning how to open your eyes and know when that is. And I would say in relationship with this talk we're having today, how would we know when that is? Because a lot of times there are people out there praying their socks off, trying to, get problems solved or, show me the way. How do we know when we're at least being answered? What does that feel like?
Great question. Right, because you're so right. There are a lot of earnest prayers, wondering if they're, feeling that connection or wondering what it feels like to get that. When I was really little, my mom gave me this wonderful bit of counsel that, whenever you can feel it inside, whenever your whole body relaxes and you even kind of giggle a little bit or something at the thought of an idea coming to you, it's from God. When it brings that sense of joy and peace, and not like you need to make something happen, but like God is just telling you about the good reality that's already here, it's from God. When something comes into thought and makes us feel tense or anxious or like, oh no, now I need to make that happen, and I think that gets back to your kind of the difference between a goal and an expectation. Ideas from God support our goal. They don't narrow our expectations. They increase our expectancy of good. A friend of mine, and this gets back to the humility, I think, which just enables this kind of inspiration to go on. A friend of mine, when he was a high school senior, had struggled for, a week or two with painful teeth and a swollen mouth, and it finally occurred to him that his wisdom teeth were coming in. And he was unable to eat normally and, was just kind of moping around the house. And finally his mother said to him, and they were practicing Christian Scientists, and his mother said to him, okay, you call the dentist or you call a Christian Science practitioner who is someone who takes prayer requests. But she said, I want this taken care of. And she wanted him to make the decision. And so he decided to call a Christian Science practitioner. And he did this while the rest of his family was enjoying a nice dinner downstairs. He couldn't eat. And so he called this practitioner and reported the symptoms to her. And instead of talking about his teeth, she just really turned the conversation in a different direction and just asked him about his family. I think she was friends with the family and just asked about his parents and that type of thing. And how's your relationship with the parents? And it came out that he was planning to buy a motorcycle, which was somewhat against his parents' wishes. And she said something to him like, well, if you bought a motorcycle and rode it responsibly, I think we could trust divine love, God, to keep you safe. But do you really need the bike right now? Is it worth the conflict with your parents? You're going to move out soon. Could you buy it then?
Right.
And and that was not his expectation. He'd already put a down payment on this bike. His expectation was he was going to get the bike. But when she mentioned that to him, I think he felt that feeling that you're talking about, that sense of opening up, maybe even tinged a little bit with a relief. After some mental struggling, he decided to, I would say honor his father and mother, as it says in the commandments, and wait a couple of years to buy the bike. And he put his will aside and felt that sense of relief. And he told me that in that moment, all the pain and discomfort just drained away. And he went downstairs to join his family for dinner, and he actually kept his wisdom teeth and still has them today.
Wow.
And he did get a bike that he loved, and isn't that what God does? I mean, he kind of got to have his cake and eat it too once he surrendered.
Why do you think people feel confusion in moments like that, though? What do you think goes on there?
It's not what the world expects. And to be honest, when he told me this story, I thought, I wonder if I would have had the humility in that moment to surrender. I mean, it's pretty easy for me not to buy a motorcycle. I'm not that interested in motorcycles. But what if it had been, like a new grand piano that I was planning on getting that I really wanted? Would I have, if it had been a right idea to wait, would I have been humble enough in that moment to surrender? And I think noise from the world, and I'll say it, internet, social media, can kind of cloud the issue. The idea of humility, and what are some other qualities we could talk about? I don't know, innocence and obedience and those types of things that make us feel close to mind and inspired aren't necessarily championed today by
compassion,
society.
for that matter. In fact, as you
right.
brought up things like social media, here's a big one now. I had left Portland, Oregon about a year after, I believe it was roughly about a year after Donald Trump was elected. And I experienced firsthand, and they became the news item all over the world, as a bunch of young people decided in protest to gather in downtown Portland where I worked. So it was real difficult, at least the first day, to get down there because these people decided to plug the street and cry and complain about how they didn't like the fact that Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Then it comes to pass that pretty much it was discovered more than 70% of these people never even bothered to vote in the first place, but they thought they'd go down and cry about it. They thought they would start breaking in windows and trashing businesses and doing all these stupid things that people sometimes like that do. Now, here's the thing that's interesting to really pull back and look at this, okay, and how a really clear spiritual idea, I would have to say, and compassion really needs to be looked at. We're living in a climate where you could look at somebody wrong this day and age, and all of a sudden you're either somebody who's about to deliver hate speech, as they're calling it now, or you're a bully, you're pushing people around. And this is what I say is true. This is actually from the mouth of one Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, if you remember, who was governor, who was running for president of the United States, who was assassinated. And he simply says everyone gets, or every society gets, the criminal they deserve. Now, when you look at the internet, what you're seeing a lot of is, they're trying to say Donald Trump is bordering on criminal behavior, and there's all these things about impeachment. He speaks his mind, he says what's on his mind, and here's what's really funny about this. So you would actually say Donald Trump is a bully. Well, what do you think about the world that's going on around him? Aren't they doing literally the same thing? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, there's a really fascinating documentary that I encourage a lot of people to watch. I think I found it on Amazon Prime, and it was called Our Freedom of Speech Apocalypse. And it is a documentary about a preacher who wants to go to talk about, love and evolution at this college. And what's really unique, what you see here, this guy stood in tremendous faith because he was really taking it. Where all these kids, all they cared about was that he understood their point of view during his speech. And I say, where did compassion go in all this, where you could just simply listen to the guy, first of all, and then you can talk. Literally, they were at the verge of stoning this guy, saying this is hate speech. And he's like, you guys aren't really paying it, but just watching this guy stand in faith and take it and keep moving forward, it's a really incredible documentary to talk about, okay, you're okay with freedom of speech and your ideas as long as you get to express them, but screw everybody else, basically. So you got to think, how do you apply these spiritual ideas? And I say compassion was a big one. I know, on the spot it's kind of hard to think of some of these things, but compassion to me is the big one because that helps us to seek to understand before we can be understood. What would you say to that?
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like, one way that listeners, for example, could contribute in this, and compassion just opens doors just like innocence and obedience and humility do, is, for us to all just address in our own thought the misconception that society is so polarized. I feel like there's a false belief that's just kind of perpetuated on social media and by fear of things different from ourselves, just like what you were talking about. Humanity, I would say, is being accused of being fractured and polarized. And I say accused because that's a word that the Bible uses, the voice that would say that we're irreconcilably fractured. The Bible calls that voice the accuser. And I feel like if the accuser were smart enough to have a goal, it would be to make our life small and afraid of others and, just thinking about ourselves, putting ourselves first rather than looking out compassionately as to how we can help our neighbor. But there's a psalm in the Bible that's been really a perfect answer to this for me, and it says, I called upon the Lord in distress. The Lord answered me and set me in a large place. And that large place to me is a mental space where we commune freely with God. And that's where we get that bigger perspective that includes our neighbors, that includes other people's outlooks. It's fine for us to have differences of opinion. I think that's the acceptance of that is something that is good for society and that makes our country good.
That's what makes life colorful in the first place is that we are different.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And if we can appreciate that and appreciate our neighbors and, compromise, wonderful things come out of compromise and of listening to one another. And I think that's a good spiritual idea.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds like one way that our listeners can contribute to helping society progress forward in that, as we're suggesting here today. The idea that we're able to shout and scream and jump up and down and throw fits with our ideas, which is certainly, I think, unique today because of social media. That you can actually open your mouth and you can rage against the machine and you can do it anonymously, That's not much more than what a bully is, but usually bullies stand their ground, at least on the playground they did.
Right.
It was much different then.
Yeah, that's right. Was that a question?
To a degree, but it's throwing it out there to see what your thoughts were on it if you had been encountered in situations like that and what you would say to our listeners about something like that.
About how they can... Oh, you mean like how they could even literally respond?
Yes, helping, how they can contribute to help society actually move forward from all this,
Right. Well, I guess I'm going to use the phrase Christian Science here because that's the background that I'm coming from. And when Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer of Christian Science, used that phrase, she was really talking about some of the ideas that you and I are talking about here, the universal laws of God. Things like compassion, things like those qualities that are talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, those universal, timeless ideas that enable healing. Both, bodily healing for an individual and social healing for humanity. And she gives this wonderful quote, and when she uses the word Christian Science here, she's talking about the universal laws of God that anybody can practice. She says, those who discern Christian Science, those who discern the laws of God, will hold crime in check. And I love that sense that our thought, even if we don't directly address, say a political adversary or somebody that's posting hate on the internet or something, even if we don't have the opportunity to directly talk to them, our thought can do so much towards shedding, we've heard this expression, shedding light instead of heat on a situation. And it's really, I think that our prayer just does a remarkable things in calming down the mental atmosphere. When we realize that, we're not obligated to be frustrated by something we read online, but that we have a source, a presence, and that presence that I talk about is why we're never alone. We have a reliable presence of ideas that correct and uplift. And this to me is based on what I read in the Bible in Genesis 1, that God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And if we trust that a little bit, if we trust that everything God made, including our neighbor, is inherently good. That positions us to see the good in him, in her. And I don't mean excusing any bad behavior or violence. I don't mean that at all. But recognizing that that isn't a true part of them, and it's not something that has to be accepted or put up with, but really they have an inherent goodness in them that is winning, that is going to win. And our prayer helps bring that out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about that. A lot of times people who react out of what seems to be a violent, aggressive tone toward anything tend to, I think, would do it from a position of fear. What would you think about that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think that the root of almost any problem really is fear. Fear of change, fear of lacking resources, fear of change, like the protesters that you were talking about. I mean, I'm sure that was something that motivated them to, any vandalism that they would have done wasn't really righteousness. It was fear, fear of people who are different than we are. And I think that kind of thinking tends to derail clear thinking, and it makes us act in ways that actually, in the long run, aren't even in our own best interest. I mean, it tricks us.
Absolutely. Now, as a praying person, in your prayers, what has stood out for you the most when it comes to, the prayers for the world?
Well, I think it might be this handling of fear. A mentor of mine liked to recommend a way to pray that was beyond just ourselves. And he would say this is how he put it, in prayer, take the world into your arms each morning and tell it not to be afraid. And I love the feeling that I have when I think along those lines. We're not naive. I mean, people that are praying and really seeking reform and uplift in their community and in their world are not naive people. So we're not looking past problems. But this kind of prayer, to me, opens up practical solutions to problems. And it requires being aware of the good reality that I talked about, the one and only spiritual creation, Genesis 1, that God has here for us right now. If God saw everything that he made and it was good, and if we're basing our lives and our understanding on that very basic premise, we understand better why we don't need to react to what our eyes and ears are telling us. That there are practical solutions to the larger problems that our dear world is facing, things like climate change or polarized voters, war-torn countries, human trafficking, and all of that. New ideas from God give us the inspiration to act meaningfully. I can give you an example here, but you talk.
Yeah, no,
Go
this
ahead.
is real quick. I thought it was funny because, as you take a look at these problems and you step into them, you realize, like I think anybody does at first, is that they're so big, what difference do I make? Now, this leads me to a discussion or a conversation I had with a gentleman not too long ago, and he was kind of feeling like he would step on eggshells because he kind of wanted to talk with politics about me. However, he wasn't sure, and I said, why don't you go ahead and try me? And so he did. And so he brought up Donald Trump, and I said, okay, what is, let's say, one thing about him and his administration that bothers you? And so as he answered the question, I said, okay, well, that seems reasonable. So now that you've pointed out the problem, what solution do you have? And then he says, well, this is what I think I should do. And I said, have you been able to actually initiate that particular solution in your own community, maybe your next-door neighbor, maybe the store that you go into to buy groceries? Do you see the point? It's funny how we'll surrender all these things to somebody that we believe is supposed to be solving this for us when you're the solution right there at the simplest level.
Oh, I love
we
it.
don't need politics to get in the way of all this nonsense. We are the solution right there. And and he just kind of lightened up a little bit, like, I didn't think about it that way before. And I was thinking, well, you're 48 years old. Maybe by now you should.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Starting in our own backyard. It's starting in our own consciousness and letting that impact our own backyard and working out from there.
And then you were about to say something, I'm sure, pretty profound.
Well, this was just a I had a kind of a, sometimes you have an experience that's so inspiring that it just spills out into other areas. And when I had that, I think I told you that experience that I had with my dissertation, and it just,
Right.
I was really reaching out to God desperately there. Now, it might sound like grad student drama, but at least in the moment, this was going to have a profoundly bad impact on my life if I didn't get it set up correctly. And it just, I feel like divine love just provided such a natural outcome for me in such an easy way. And I couldn't help but, when I left that meeting at the campus, I couldn't help but just see, and I'm sure you've had this experience after hearing you talk, it seems like you would appreciate this. I could just see God at work everywhere when I looked around, or love. I mean, every person I saw just seemed like the outcome of a loving, good God. And I think I mentioned this quote earlier about those who discern Christian Science, or those who discern this universal law of love will hold crime in check. I wasn't thinking about that at all when I left campus that day, but on the way home I stopped at the grocery store to buy some food. And inside the store, unbeknownst to me, a fight was kind of brewing, and these two tough-looking young women were engaged in what looked like a pretty heated dispute. And they were yelling at each other and insulting each other, and it looked like it was about to get physical. I think there was some jealousy involved, probably a love triangle or something. And the customers in the area just scattered, not wanting to get involved. And that whole scene that I was watching was so at odds with the good feeling that I had inside, the trust that divine love really was working on everyone's behalf, giving us good solutions, giving us ideas, even if we didn't articulate the idea that we got, giving us the feeling of being loved and included and not needing to be violent, for example, to get a good outcome. And so, sometimes when you see a scene like that, you think, oh, wow, that looks pretty bad. Somebody should do something. Like you were saying, somebody should do something about that. And then it occurred to me, I could be part of the solution. And for the first time, I didn't feel self-conscious or anything. I just found myself approaching these two women, and pretty soon I was standing between the two of them. And I put my hands on the arms of one of the women. They didn't pay any attention to me at first, and so to get her attention, I put my hands on her arms real gently until she made eye contact. And when she made eye contact with me, I feel like I just saw something beautiful in her, not with my eyes and ears, but with my heart. Love was there, and she was the outcome of love, and that didn't include violence and rage. And I just said to her really simply, you don't have to act this way. And it kind of took her by surprise a little bit. And she said, what'd you say? And I just said in the same voice, kind of as a promise, as a joyful recognition, you don't have to act this way. And the second time I said it just clicked with her, because all the fight just went out of her and her shoulders relaxed, and she actually turned and walked off peacefully without even saying anything more. And the other woman, who saw there was no fight left, walked off, and customers went back to their shopping, and that was it. It was just lovely. And I had no intention of stopping a fight, of course. That wasn't why I went to the store at all, but I just couldn't help it. And I didn't really stop the fight. I feel like love got there first. And that presence, that loving presence that eliminates crime, for example, is something I talk about in the lecture.
Wow. It's pretty crazy, too, when you engage people, especially with the talk that you give, the kind of responses that people must be sharing with you in stories. Is there any that stand out for you?
Oh, you mean that somebody has come up and shared with me afterwards?
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And I'm going to, just to clarify before I tell that story, I'm just going to say when I'm talking about this loving presence, the word that I use, and I have learned this from the Christian Science textbook, and it's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer of Christian Science. The word that I have learned to use for this presence is Christ. Christ was Jesus' title, of course, but it's also the healing, loving activity of God that's working on our behalf right now. And that presence is always with us. That presence is why we're never alone. And so when this story that I'm going to talk to you about is such a lovely example of this presence of Christ. And this was just shared with me recently. somebody came up to me afterwards and told me about a story that they had actually just read about in the news. Apparently, an elderly woman had just finished grocery shopping, and she, wheeled her cart to the car, unloaded, got in the car, and was about to drive away when a guy forced his way into her car and put a gun to her ribs and asked her for her wallet and all her money. Well, the most amazing thing happened. She had the presence of mind not to be afraid in that moment. And it's amazing what that fearlessness on her part did, both for herself. I mean, it was a protection to her, but what a blessing to this guy, too, because what happened was she said to him something like, "Young man, God is in the car with me right now. And if you shoot me, I'm going straight to heaven." So she was not afraid. And he was so amazed and I think disarmed by her fearlessness, maybe not by any religious dogma or anything. I don't know that was really what piqued his interest as much as, wow, what is enabling this woman to be utterly unafraid? I've got a gun. How is she not afraid? And to my sense, it was that presence of Christ right there with her, enabling her to feel that loving, healing presence of God. So they ended up having about a 10-minute conversation, apparently. Obviously, he completely changed his mind about robbing her. And I would love to have heard what they talked about. I don't know that, but I know it was a spiritual conversation. And after they finished talking, he got ready to leave. And as he got out of the car, she said, "Oh, young man, one more thing." And he turned around, and she handed him all the money in her wallet.
Yeah, imagine what he was just about to throw away there. That money wouldn't have been able to help him at all. Rough stuff. And maybe that was the presence that was available to make him realize the kind of situation he was putting himself into, And it's funny how often, people like him, for instance, you look at them as criminals, and there are some of them that just are, But a lot of them are at times put in situations they can't think of another way to help them out of a situation they're in than to do that. I mean, that's desperation right there, because that puts you into a lot of heat. That's kind of crazy.
Well, that brings me back to your quality of compassion, I think, because if we realize that, we have a little wiggle room. That lady had wiggle room that she took advantage of it completely. I mean, I think we can feel desperate too if we're put in a situation like that as a victim. The victims can feel desperate too, but there is that. Oh, this goes back to that Bible verse I said, "God hath set me in a large space." We have more room than we realize, and there's room for reformation in a would-be criminal's heart, and we can be that agent for change.
I like what my wife will tend to say, especially when things seem kind of chaotic and out of control. God's bigger than all this. So there's your wiggle room. It's pretty big.
Yeah.
So, and I think the biggest thing, too, I guess, with the message today, because I remember one of my original questions was, how do you know when you're receiving that message? When it's rather prayer, you're looking for an answer, show me the way. And I think we've really pretty much specifically hit it on the head. You'll know the message because of how it feels as you're receiving it versus one that maybe you're creating or hoping to hear, which, still leaves you with the question, of uncertainty. Whereas what you were talking about and what we've experienced is there's that calm presence of confidence that says, no, this is the way to do it. As silly as it may seem in the moment, maybe to me or anybody else, this just feels right. You just know it does because you calm down. You can feel that. Would that be true?
Oh, yes. Yeah. There's I would call it spiritual sense, too. And there's a line that's been really meaningful to me in Science and Health, and I'll see if I can tell it to you. She says, Mary Baker Eddy, the author, writes something like, spiritual sense involves intuition, hope, faith, understanding, fruition, reality. And I love that kind of ascending scale of qualities that we all can relate to, I think. Particularly, the first rung on the ladder is intuition. Intuition is such a lovely halfway point between heart and head, I think. It's kind of how you feel and what you're thinking. And we all can relate to times when intuition has just been a really good guide for us. And again, maybe thwarting what our eyes and ears were telling us or what maybe we think previous experience would tell us or something, but we have this feeling inside. And when we surrender an intellectual sense to, that humble receptivity to divine mind, to an even bigger intelligence, that intuition grows into things like hope and faith and understanding. I mean, spiritual understanding. And then the fruition is when we see it manifested around us.
Amazing stuff. I'm sure that the audience, as you are ready to prepare for your lecture, is going to be mesmerized by what you have to share with them, and certainly grateful at the same time. And I want to thank you for being on the program to share your message with our listeners out there. And, hope and definitely faith are something we can certainly use in this world today, and not necessarily toward others. That is very important. But the hope and the faith that yourself, that no matter what situation you find yourself in, what experience you're about to have, that you have everything you need to work through it and to grow and to gain that wisdom. It seems to be the real gold when it comes right down to it, isn't it?
That is. Recognizing that we have what we need already is powerful. Yeah, that's right.
Well, Melanie, again, thank you for being on the program. And how can people find out more about this lecture series that you're involved in?
Well, maybe I can start by making an announcement. I'm speaking a week from tonight, Thursday evening. That's November 7th, at 7:15 p.m., and this is at the PSU Native American Student and Community Center. So if people Google Portland Lecture Series, Christian Science, or even probably just Portland Lecture Series, the materials will come up and they can read more and probably see an online flyer. But it's a week from tonight on the campus there.
And is there a way they might be able to connect with you directly and find out more about your work?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. They can, if you look at Christian Science Board of Lectureship online, there's a montage of all the lecturers, and you can click on me, Melanie Wahlberg. There's a picture of all of us.
Well, very good. Melanie, again, thank you for being on the program today to share your message with our listeners. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Daniel. I hope what I've shared has helped move folks forward. And, I can also add that listeners can engage with ideas like these on just ChristianScience.com. And, of course, at local Christian Science reading rooms and churches.
There you go. Thank you again, Melanie, for being on the program today.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.